Hi, dudes and dudettes, it's me, H. Ivins, and this is another edition of the Radical Reset. As I'm talking to you, and this is actually another timely episode of the Radical Reset, riots continue to go on across the country. And I spoke in an earlier podcast about the reasons why, and basically that they were caused by nihilism. Nihilism, which I defined in the the summary for this episode that's posted below it, by the way. I define what nihilism is according to Webster's dictionary, but basically it means not giving a shit. You know, if you think that you are hopeless, if you believe that everything is set against you, if you are cynical, and there's a difference between skeptical and cynical. I'm skeptical. You know, if you tell me this is going to do, if there's a product that's going to do something miraculous, you know, I don't say automatically it'll never work. I say, show me. That's skeptical. But these people are cynical. There's nothing you could say, nothing you could do, nothing we could say, nothing society could say, nothing that their leadership, when I say their leadership, I'll get into who they are in just a minute, could say, that's going to change their mind. And this is a byproduct of years and years and years of making foolish trade-offs. Now, let me begin, and I'm going to try to do this in a systematic and thoughtful fashion. And of course, as always, you can read more about what my solutions are and what the anti-political solutions are to everything in A Radical Reset, the Manifesto of Antipolitism, available to you on Amazon. And if you're a Prime member, you can borrow it from the Kindle Lending Library for free. Otherwise, it's a nominal charge. Okay, so the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And the good intentions that we all had, particularly as it related to in the late 1950s and early 1960s, after years of Jim Crow and persecution, a lot of white Americans felt very bad about what had happened to black Americans, and black Americans themselves were protesting in the streets, particularly in the 1960s, under the leadership of Dr. King, and at the other end of the spectrum, people like Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Now, happily, the mainstream of black thought at the time followed Dr. King prior to his assassination. We all know this history. I'm not going to go through it again. But the bottom line is that there is a sub-narrative that was being discussed at the time that's reinforced. And, you know, because the road to hell is paved with good intentions, let me begin by saying that Dr. King, as one example, is one of my personal heroes. I think he's a remarkable figure. And the reason that I think he's remarkable, by the way, is that he had to know that he was a dead man walking. Put everything else aside. Let's not get into the discussion of what he believed or didn't believe or said or didn't say or did or didn't do. And yes, he had personal failings. And I'm not even going to list what those are now. They're irrelevant, because in the end, this great man who preached peaceful change knew, in light of the times he was in great personal physical danger. He was jailed many times. And his assassination, and I was alive at the time, I remember the day Dr. King was assassinated, it really didn't come as a surprise to anybody, white or black. It was a horrible tragedy. I remember shedding tears over it. But I still feel those feelings. I'm an enormous admirer of Dr. King, but in fact, it was not a surprise in context of the time. But his good intentions and the good intentions of the leadership of the civil rights movement at the time, and of a lot of well-intentioned people in politics in the beginning, combined with cynical power seekers, produced the problem that we have now. When it comes to human affairs, the important thing to understand in this discussion, and in all discussions, and this is a theme that I'm going to repeatedly hit moving forward in these podcasts, is that there are no solutions to human problems, only trade-offs. In other words, we can make a problem better, but only if we make something worse somewhere else. And we have to look at what that trade-off is, and is the trade-off worth it? So, turning the clock back, what caused these riots? What caused these riots, and they're nothing new, is not the murder of George Floyd, God rest his soul. Yes, that's a murder. Yes, the cop that did it is already in jail. He's not in prison yet. He hasn't been convicted, but he will go to prison, probably for the rest of his life. And the other three that stood around watching George Floyd be killed are almost certainly going to be indicted, and the only reason that they haven't is because the prosecutor rightfully is taking his time. The prosecutor in this case is the county attorney in Minneapolis, to build a case because he doesn't want a clever defense attorney to take it apart and get these guys released. So that's not the problem. The problem is nihilism. In other words, the George Floyd murder was an excuse to separate two groups, okay? One group are the legitimate protesters who believe that black lives and all lives matter. I have no quarrel with them, and we're just going to say, great for them, okay? And what the police should be doing, in my opinion, in order to differentiate the peaceful crowds from the violent crowds, in my opinion, is the police ought to march with and protect the peaceful protesters and take up their cause. If I were the mayor of an American city around now, and I were an anti-political mayor, so politics meant nothing to me, and I was just going to talk about what's right or wrong, I would be out as the mayor marching with the peaceful protesters as an example of what free speech, what First Amendment rights are, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of speech, in order to demonstrate that this country not only allows protest, but embraces it. But that's not what's going on in these riots. These are nihilistic youth, primarily black youth, burning down their own neighborhoods, primarily, not totally. Here in Phoenix, they were burning Scottsdale, which is a wealthy neighborhood, which weirdly, to me at least, makes more sense than burning down your own neighborhood. But primarily, it's black youths burning down black neighborhoods. And why do they do this? They do this because they're nihilistic. And they're nihilistic because of trade-offs made that went back to the 1960s. Now, the first trade-off that we made in the 1960s is we being the mostly white people, but what's lost in all this legislation that's been passed to benefit black people over the last 60 years, since the Lyndon Johnson presidency and the war on poverty and the Great Society, all of this legislation was passed primarily by white people. Now, they could have only two motive, because black people only make up 17% of the population, and they make up far less of Congress. Now, remember, in an anti-political Congress, black people would, in fact, be approximately 17% of the Congress. But in a, politics as usual Congress, that's not the case, obviously. 17% of the Congress is not black. 17% of the Congress historically, going back to the 1960s, is certainly not black. So it was actually well-intentioned white people, primarily Democrats, who passed these laws in order to benefit black people. But they didn't understand that they were... The problem with politicians, just as this is not off the subject, but even a well-meaning politician, a lot of them don't understand this concept. There are no solutions to human problems, only trade-offs. So when Lyndon Johnson set off to end poverty, that's impossible. Jesus said it best: the poor will always be with us. If you think about it logically, we all began in poverty. The whole world, the human race, began in poverty. Wherever we are today is as a result of all of us being our descendants and our families and the people alive now and who have been alive before us to establish our culture, have lifted us out of poverty. But poverty, absolute poverty, having nothing, is where the entire human race began. Okay, so the fact that there are still some people who are lagging others is just a reflection of the difference in ability, and also a reflection in the countries that they live in. And but in the United States, since this is the freest, comparatively so, economy in the world historically, at least in the last couple of hundred years, the reason that there are poor people in America is that these people have not competed. And when they don't compete, they of course lag those that do. We still have a system primarily to this day based on merit. But back in the 1960s, under Lyndon Johnson, the idea was, and it was well-meaning, that we could end poverty because they didn't think this all the way through. So they made some trade-off decisions. One of the programs, the biggest program that they put into place, was one called Aid to Family with Dependent Children, AFDC. AFDC is welfare, as we know. We just call it welfare, but AFDC is the actual technical term of welfare. And it said to young black mothers, and it was originally intended for young black mothers, but it became all young mothers ultimately, and up until today. We will pay you, okay, so that you and your children at home, and if you don't have a husband or a father around, can afford to take care of your children. Now, obviously, if we're going to pay you to take care of your children absent a husband, there can't be a husband. That created what's called a perverse incentive. And this perverse incentive was that young girls, teenage girls, want to leave home, okay? And here was their ticket to ride. So here was the government willing to pay them as long as they had a baby and there was no guy around. There couldn't be a guy in the apartment or the house, because if there were, they wouldn't get their check. So this created the incentive to create an enormous explosion in single parent births. So in the black community in 1959, less than 5% of black children were born into one-parent families, where today it's over 70%. Among the white population, it was unheard of. Today it's over 36%. Among the Latino population at that time, it was unheard of. Today it's 52%. You get more of whatever you subsidize. And the trade-off we made was we would take money from the responsible people who have been successful and have gotten married and have had their children in wedlock and have made enough money that they are in fact paying taxes. Because remember, poor people in this country pay zero income tax. I mean, I know that flies in the face of political rhetoric, but it's the truth. The bottom half of the wage earner scale pays essentially zero income tax. The rich pay most of the taxes. Again, you want to deny reality, that's fine. There's an enormous, on the right and the left, depending on what issue we're talking about, there's an enormous almost human ability, I think it's part of being a human being, to deny objective reality if it conflicts with what you believe. And there are a lot of people out there that believe that the rich should be paying the bill for the poor, but they are. And when you point that out and you show statistics to somebody who believes that, they simply reject it. They go, oh, that's not true, but it is. You can deny reality all you want, but facts are inconvenient things. So we have taken money. The trade-off here is we've taken money away from the people using it productively, investing it, growing it, creating businesses, hiring employees, making the economy grow, to give it to poor people to mitigate their problems. The problem is that if you were to look at a graph and you were to, and by the way, I encourage you to do your own Google search, and you were to look at a graph, you would see that poverty from the end of the Civil War and the end of slavery at the creation of the 13th Amendment in 1865, all the way through 1965, poverty had dropped. 86% of blacks were poor at the time slavery was repealed in 1865, but by 1965, it was less than a third of the black population without any social programs at all. An enormous reduction in poverty had taken place among the black population with no social programs. No AFDC, no welfare, no payments, no food stamps, no nothing, no social safety net, and black people had worked their way up and had been very successful on their own. This is the untold story of black America, and had gotten married and raised their children and opened businesses and gone to colleges, some black colleges, some white colleges. And remember, in the story where the white guy's supposed to be evil and terrible and the rich guys are evil and terrible, it's important to remember that, for example, primarily black colleges like Morehouse College in Atlanta were funded with entirely white money. I used Morehouse because all of the money to build Morehouse, which is the original black college, came from John D. Rockefeller, who was a devout Southern Baptist. And since black people are by and large, have been historically and continue to be by and large Southern Baptists, he funded Morehouse College as a college for black people because he was himself of Dutch descent. Rockefellers are Dutch, and not a bigot, and a northerner, and grew up in a culture where black people were equal, and he was the richest man in the world, and he used some of his riches to enrich the poorest people in the society at the time, black people. So without a welfare state, private charity was providing for the black population, and it was working. The black population went from 86% poor to less than 30% poor. And then the funny thing happened is that when we made the trade-off of forcibly robbing, because remember, everything the government does, it does through coercion and force. You can't voluntarily pay taxes. You must pay taxes or you will go to prison. That's force. If you try to run away, you will be arrested. That's force. If you try to defend yourself while running away, you will be shot. That's force. The government achieves everything for force. Nothing the government does is done voluntarily. So in this case, through the force of confiscation of the money from those who were succeeding, including black people who were succeeding, we created this welfare program, AFDC, and destroyed the black, Latino, white, in fact, all minority groups with the exception of Asians. Where today 70% of black children are raised in single-parent families, 1 in 67 descendants of Korean families are born into single parents. That'll give you an idea of the difference between Asians and blacks, and why it is no coincidence that Asians in this country are phenomenally successful, and unfortunately black people have now it established the law of unintended consequences, which is a big part of these trade-offs. If we go back to that graph where poverty was plummeting, it just leveled off. And now we have a permanent black underclass and a permanent white underclass and a permanent Latino underclass of the children of single parents that's growing, by the way, because when you don't pay the bill, you don't care about anything. That's nihilism. So these people have not just one child or two children, 3, 4, 5, 6, because every child means more checks. And every time they get more checks, that's the perverse incentive. And they're not taking control of these children. And worse than that, there's another trade-off that was made, or another cultural shift, not trade-off, but cultural shift, and that is the narrative of black victimhood. So, upon the death of Martin Luther King, who never, by the way, bought into the black victimhood narrative, and while he certainly spoke of the legacy of slavery, he didn't view it as a permanent constraint on black achievement, and neither did Malcolm X, to his credit. He believed that, of course, black people should pull themselves up among their own community, and as he got older, he became more mellow and less violent. But that's as an aside. The bottom line is that these leaders, although coming at it from two different angles, weren't espousing black victimhood the way it's understood today. And the way it's morphed and turned today is that you are the, I'm speaking, if I were sharing the legacy of slavery victimhood argument, you are the victims of slavery, and therefore you cannot escape because there is systemic white racism that keeps you down. You will never get the same jobs, you will never get the same ability, you will never achieve. Therefore, the reason they're out rioting, bringing it to today's riots, is if you believe that, and these guys do believe it. When I was in prison, I knew tons and tons of guys from the black underclass and from the Latino underclass and so on and the white underclass, obviously. I was just surrounded by them and all their skinhead things. And the skinheads are just a manifestation, the same as black gangs or Latino gangs. It's just white gangs. And the common thread in all of them is they're nihilistic. They just don't believe, neither the black guys nor the white guys nor the Latino guys of that socioeconomic class. I tell you from firsthand experience, none of them believe there's a chance that they can escape their predicament. Therefore, why not burn down your own neighborhood? Why not burn down your own house? Now, what to do about it, because I don't want this podcast to go on forever. And of course, you can read again more about this in A Radical Reset, and I'm also going to talk about at the end about joining us, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, what can we do to reverse this? How do we put the genie back in the bottle? What can we do to mitigate it? Because what we're doing now is what we always do. Every time there's a crisis like this, when there are riots, we're going to get now a month of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. Of course, Black Lives Matter. All lives matter. But that's what we're going to get. Just like if, God forbid, this were a school shooting, we would then spend the next month talking about gun control, and it will all come to nothing. Politicians will blah, 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 and they'll all talk about it, and there'll be a lot of praying. I'm going to pray for this one, and I'm going to pray for that one, and I'm praying for the city, and please pray for us. And I realize I'm an agnostic and I'm not a spiritual person, and I don't mean to make fun of prayer, and prayer has many benefits. I understand that, but it's not going to change the outcome of what's going on. It's just a lot of talk in politics. So let's talk about real solutions, and that are also trade-offs, but trade-offs, I believe, for the good, and what an anti-political legislature would do. What an anti-political legislature would do is what I've talked about in the past, but I'm going to bring it now into just an organized, systemic program. One, repeal welfare. Look, if obviously the trade-off was by taking money from the wealthy to give to the poor, we created a permanent underclass, the obvious solution is go back to what we were doing before, which is to say nothing. Now, when I say nothing, I realize the knee-jerk reaction to that is, well, people are going to start. No, they're not. No, they're not. They're going to make decisions based on their own survival. And those decisions are going to be, A, to go to work, and B, to bring back things like, for example, shotgun weddings. A shotgun wedding doesn't mean literally a shotgun, guys. You realize, of course, I'm not talking about literally a shotgun. I'm talking about if you knock a girl up, you're going to marry her, okay? And the father, and the mother of the girl that got knocked up is going to go to the parents of the boy that knocked her up, and they're going to force that wedding because it's the only way it can work. There's got to be a family to raise that child, okay? It's not a village, it's a family. Fuck you, Hillary Clinton, you were wrong. It does not take a village to raise a child, it takes a family. And to reestablish the family, you have to take away the trade-off and the subsidization of the bad behavior. So the first thing an anti-political legislature would do is to repeal welfare and replace it with nothing. There doesn't need to be a social safety net. Able-bodied people can work. Okay. Now, at the same time, an anti-political legislature would also repeal the minimum wage. The minimum wage is not about giving a minimum living wage to people. It's about getting into the workforce and learning those habits at a price that justifies your participation. In other words, in English, if I'm a business owner and a young, for example, in the inner city, I'll pretend I'm in the inner city, I own, let's say, a bodega in Manhattan, and a young black man comes to me and says, I'd like to work in your store, but if I have to pay him $15 an hour and he has no job skills whatsoever, I'm not going to hire him because he's not worth $15 an hour. The time that I'm going to have to take to train him to do what he has to do, and what I'm going to have to go through, and the leap of faith I'm going to have to take to hire him, to trust that he's going to show up for work every day when perhaps he has no work history at all because he's just a kid, is not worth it to me. So I would rather hire even someone at more money, frankly, and bring them in because I know the job will get done right. And what's missing in all these discussions, whenever these do-gooders start into the minimum wage discussion, is they forget that all workers are not equal in ability. And the whole purpose of a minimum wage, well, frankly, it was originally incepted to keep, believe it or not, ironically, this is a historic truth, look this up, Google it. The minimum wage was originally set up to keep black people out of the workforce and competing from whites. In other words, rather than be able to pay black people less who had no job skills back in the day before the Great Society, Jim Crow, under the Jim Crow laws, particularly in the South, they passed minimum wages so that if you had to pay a black guy the same thing as a white guy, you'd always hire the white guy because the white guy has work experience and the black guy didn't. And still, they reduced their poverty rate overall. But get rid of the minimum wage, and that brings the young in particular back into the workforce. People forget that wages are like anything else. They're priced based on value, okay? And an employer will pay, and I've been an employer for decades, okay? An employer will pay what the employee is worth and will give the employee a raise not to lose them because two reasons. Number one, a valuable employee is the key to business succeeding. And number two, it costs a fortune to keep retraining employees because in business, time is money. And the time that an employer spends retraining a new employee would be better spent using those resources elsewhere. This is something business understands the government never gets, okay, is the efficient use of money. So anyway, to keep this brief, because I don't want this podcast to go on forever, we would repeal welfare, which would force families back into marriage and force families back into pulling together and also naturally control the birth rate. You don't have to talk about birth control and abortion. You can make money do the job for you. Those of you who are pro-life or pro-choice, nobody wants unwanted pregnancies. Get rid of the government support and those things largely go away too. The second step, of course, is the weed and seed program that I proposed before, where we pay $10,000 to anyone who voluntarily sterilizes, and we pay for the sterilization as well, male or female. And it's a completely voluntary program, and I've made it sound very simplistic, but because it's voluntary, it is not coercive. But we would be getting people, $10,000 to people on the way up is nothing, but to people at the bottom. Frankly, we can't keep allowing this underclass to keep breeding in a subsidized manner. There's no other way to put it, because that's who's out in the street rioting. If we want to return safety to our streets, we have to get rid of the people creating the unsafe environment. And while rescinding AFDC, getting rid of welfare, will be a huge step. The second step has to be from those people that are just wantonly, irresponsible and/or addicts, for that matter. We don't want them having children. The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. That's the bottom line. That's an old saying. It's true. The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. I remember when I was a kid briefly, and I would, talk to my parents about I have a new girl that I'm dating, they would always ask, what do her parents do? And I would always say, what fucking difference does that make? I didn't say fucking to my own parents, by the way, but I said, what difference does that make? And they would say, my mother always said, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. And it's really true. You look at the parents, you see what the kids are going to be like. My ex-wife Terry, who as you know, I adore her. If you looked at her mother, you'd see a beautiful older woman aging gracefully, who's just a magnificent person, and Terry's exactly the same way. It's not some kind of a surprise. The apple doesn't fall too far from the tree. So if you have, an addict having babies, they're going to have addict babies. And as much as babies are adorable, they grow up to be adults very fast. And the next thing you know, they're riding on your streets in Minneapolis and in Phoenix and in Atlanta and in Washington across the country. How do we prevent it? Prevent them from ever being born. How do we do that without being fascists? Simple. We make a voluntary program. We make a trade-off. We take money from the successful to give to the poor in return for an action that they take that benefits everybody, including themselves. They don't need those children to support, and we don't need those children out growing up to become rioters in the streets. So if we withdraw welfare and we institute weed and seed, in the future, if by magic there could be an anti-political legislature today, in the future there would never be these kind of riots again, because it's a pragmatic solution and the trade-offs are made. Now, again, there are always going to be poor people, and some poor people, by the way, before anyone starts writing me letters, some poor people are poor because they can't help it, because they're paraplegics, quadriplegics, mentally, I'm going to say mentally retarded, and I know that's not the political correct term. What's the word I'm looking for? Mentally disabled or disability. There are plenty of private charities that take care of that. The fact of the matter is, during the 19th century, when there was no welfare state at all, and the government spent 3% of our budget versus the 51% it's starting to spend now. Can you believe that? The federal government eats up 51% of the national income. But historically, it was 3% until Franklin Roosevelt became president. And the bottom line is this: when that was the case, enormous. It was the century of charity. Morehouse College that I spoke about earlier was founded in the 1800s. Cornell University, 1890. How many things do you know of, major institutions that exist today as charitable endeavors were founded in the 1800s by private money when there was no tax, there was no income tax. The income tax didn't come into play until the early 1900s. There was no incentives other than the desire of those with to help those without. And the small number of people relative to the population that need help because they are physically or mentally disabled, there's plenty of private charity to take care of that. There's no trade-off needs to be made. That will be done voluntarily because that's who Americans are. That's who we've always been. We have always been culturally generous. Remember, again, I point out to you that all the laws protecting black people were passed by white people, which makes a lie, by the way, of systemic white racism. Because if that were the case, none of those laws would ever be passed, and these black people would be left to their own device, which ironically would have been better when you look at the reduction of poverty on the graph. Okay, that's the end of today's podcast. I think I've made my point. We'll move on to new trade-offs in the next podcast, and unless something earth-shaking happens, the next podcast we're going to talk about the trade-offs of our personal freedom we've made as a result of the COVID-19 crisis, and I'll be putting that up in just a few days. Now, before I go, I want to talk a little bit about what you can do to help bring about an anti-political future. We are in the nascent stages of anti-politism. What I mean by the nascent stages is we're just beginning to form our movement. So what I'd like you to do is two things. A, I'd like you to comment on this podcast and talk about the things that you see as trade-offs that we make as a society that need to be changed. And secondly, I want you to subscribe and join the movement, and we're going to organize, and my role is going to be your leader in this organization as the founder of the movement, and we're going to set up an infrastructure so that we can grow it. Every great movement begins with the first step, and I need you to be a part of that, you to join as part of that. So stay in touch with us, stick with antipolitism.org, join the movement, comment on this podcast, share it with your friends. We need to form neighborhood groups. We need to form cells, in other words, like the old communists used to, and form groups together of anti-politics and discuss good ideas and share your good ideas. If you have a good idea, an anti-political idea, an idea that promotes freedom and choice and merit and makes sense logically, write it. Let's talk about it. Put it below the videos that you watch. I'll adopt it. We'll talk about it. We'll build our infrastructure and we'll build our movement, and together we will save America from itself. And that's all I'm going to talk about today. I want to again remind you, pick up your copy of Radical Reset on Amazon free of charge. Click on the links below to go to the website and to share and to help build the organization. Comment on the website, share with your friends. Make sure you're subscribed. Click the notification button, share it on your social media. And until next time, this is E.H. Ivins signing off.